It's a great pleasure to welcome Adriane Esquivel and Muelbert as our speaker for the Centre for Global Wood Security's monthly seminar. Adriane started out her career in Leeds, working with Oliver Phillips, and then moved on to postdocing at Leeds with David Galbraith, and then on to the University of Birmingham, working with Tom Pugh. And then you stayed at Birmingham, becoming an assistant and associate professor. And we've been totally delighted that Adriane has decided to come and join us here in the last couple of months as our Associate Professor of Global Change Ecology. And Adriane's work is really at the forefront of our understanding of how tropical forest tree communities are being impacted by global change, particular focus on the Amazon, but Adriane has really spread her research network much wider than that, and I suspect we'll be hearing quite a lot about some of these other works going on around the tropical forests. But without further ado, Adriane, thank you so much. Looking forward to your talk.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Tom, for the invitation also to present here. So I want to start by taking you to what is probably the driest and the hottest tropical rainforest on the planet. This is on the border between the Brazilian Amazon and the Brazilian savanna, the Cerrado. But as you can see, this is a very different border, actually. This is the border now between these beautiful and very diverse ecosystems to cattle range crops, and this all deforested land that we see in this transition. And this transition is actually quite large. I'm talking here about a region called the Arc of Deforestation that expands for 500,000 square kilometers, so it's a massive area, and is a region that has been transformed particularly from the 1970s, and now is this massive fragmented area, and that also pose threats to the regions that stayed not so through the big fragment. So this big fragment now is under stress because of the edge effect, but also because this fragmentation changes the climate in the landscape. So it accelerates climate change and makes this fragment even more threatened. So it created even faster changes in temperature and drier conditions. So what we have in this system is an ecosystem that is surviving beyond its limits. A few studies that we've been working on have been showing that this system is surviving beyond its limits. But I want to highlight here the word surviving, because the systems are surviving. And when we, as ecologists, been trying to document for the last few years a lot of change that has been happening in the landscape, we also, I think, sometimes forget about how resilient these systems are. So what I want to bring to you in this talk is these two sides of the story of change, but the story of resilience and the story of resistance and adaptation. And I'm going to do this in three short research stories. First, I want to dive into a little bit more into the Amazon, this amazing place on Earth with potentially the most beautiful sunrises and sunsets that you would ever see. Place to study for many, many reasons. But the reasons that maybe convince our funders and people that are not ecologists is that this place stores between 150 to 200 gigatons of carbon. So any changes to the Amazon system will cause big changes to the climate in the planet. Also, this is a system that is responsible for around 12% of all the terrestrial carbon sinks. So not only it stores a vast amount of carbon, it contributes to climate mitigation. But also, apart from carbon, this is one of the most diverse systems on the planet. The estimations is between 6,000 and 16,000 tree species, and you can get up to 300 species in 1 hectare of forest. These are 3 species, which is also super surprising. But beyond the natural world, we have also a lot of people in the Amazon. We have 47 million people in the Amazon. And we have a lot of different cultures. So we have 410 indigenous groups and many different languages across this amazing system. And something also very amazing about this forest is that because of its beauty and its all its contribution to the planet in different ways, people have been spending a lot of time studying this system. So across the Amazon forest, we have this huge collaboration effort, which here you can see in darker colors, more and more dots that mean that you have more and more people that have been monitoring these sites over time. So these are what we call forest inventory sites, where people measure trees over time, and that allows them to understand how trees are growing and how much carbon the forest is accumulating. But importantly, what is very hard for a tropical system is that people have been working very hard to identify the species that are there. And this is work that can take years to identify 1 hectare of forest. And this spans over the last 30, 40 years, and is the work of hundreds of people, hundreds of colleagues that are extremely resilient and have been working on this forest and allow us to understand how the Amazon is changing over time. So a lot of what I'm going to show today is the work of these amazing people that we brought together and synthesized. So one of the things that we can tell with this data is that we can understand the dynamics of the Amazon over time in terms of carbon. So here in the y-axis, you have what we call net biomass change. So this is basically the balance between what goes in the system through growth and recruitment, so in the system of forest, and then what goes out of the system through mortality. So Amazonian forests are mature forests. They are expected to be in equilibrium. So the amount of carbon that goes in and out is in balance. So we expect the Amazon forest to be inside, on top of that 0 line. But the Amazon could also be working as a carbon sink, could be absorbing more carbon than emitting. And or if mortality rates are too high, the Amazon forest can be working as a carbon source. Eco there. What we have now, and we've seen this, and we have known this for now 10 years, is that the Amazon until 2010 has been working mostly as a carbon sink. So the line is above the 0 line. But this trend, there is a negative trend here with the capacity of the Amazon to absorb carbon declining over time. And one of the reasons, or the main reason behind this trend, is the increasing tree mortality across the basin. So here, when we look at not net carbon change, but biomass loss, biomass mortality across the Amazon, we see that mortality has been increasing over time. And we can see big jumps in this graph in the El Nino of 97. In the big Amazonian drought of 2005, that was the strongest drought in a century. Then the other big Amazonian drought in 2010, that was again the strongest drought ever observed. And then if you continue this forward, we look at the 2015 El Nino, where Amy Bennett and Tayani Souza led this study looking at what's happening in 2015. And we see each of these arrows is one of these inventories. You see a lot of arrows going up and down. When you put everything together, we see that the average net carbon that used to be above 0 now is, in 2015, it got to a point of carbon neutrality. So the Amazon was not working as a carbon sink anymore. The Amazonian carbon sink stopped in 2015. And that was, again, driven by an increasing mortality. Oops, where is the arrow? Yes, an increasing mortality during the El Nino years that then was similar to the amount of productivity. And then the carbon sink basically stopped. And this changing the system, changing the Amazonian system. So we are seeing this combination both of increased aridity through the droughts, but also greater liana load, so higher CO2 tend to favor lianas. These are the woody vines that you can see in this photo that make it very hard to walk in the forest, but also it's hard for trees because they can create a lot of load in the crown. They compete for light. They can lead to crown breakage that can then kill the tree. So this is a very big tree that died in one of our sites in the south of the Amazon. And it opened these big gaps in the forest. When you have more gaps, you have greater changes in the microclimate. So you have less of that shaded areas in the forest. You have more areas of light that goes in, and also of heat. When you're in the tropical forest, these systems, these gaps, as you can see here, they are also extremely hot. And then this creates a positive feedback when you are creating a system that favors more lianas, greater mortality of trees. Then you tend to have more gaps that will favor some types of trees. So you favor species that tend to be more fast growing. And then you create this system that is overall faster and a more degraded system. This is what is described as expected from the Amazon tipping point, where you would have warming or extreme droughts leading to degraded forests that favor opportunistic plants that then will create a forest that is even more degraded. And this is very bleak, but I want to pause here and to look at this again, but from a resilience point of view. So if we look again at the data of increased mortality across the Amazon, but we split by region, what we see is that only in the south of the Amazon, this region that is extremely fragmented and extremely dry and extremely hot, that's the only place that since 2005 we have been where the droughts became more frequent, that we observed this jump in mortality. It's not a small jump in mortality, it's a big jump in mortality. It's from 2 to around 3%. So it's a 50% increase in mortality, but it's not happening in the other places, meaning that potentially the majority of the forest is still holding there. So, so this is one point of resilience. Potentially most of the Amazon, if not super fragmented. So if we stop fragmentation, most of the Amazon can stay resilient. So the second point, of course, is stopping climate change too. But I'm talking about here is that this very fragmented area so far is the only area where we have a very big jump in mortality. What we are also seeing is that the forest is somehow adapting to the new environmental conditions. So when we looked at which species are changing in the Amazon, the new species that are coming, what we call the recruits, the new trees in the forest, tend to be from species that are more adapted to drought. So over time here, we see this is a metric in the y-axis of what we call water deficit affiliation, but it's basically a metric using biogeography that to estimate how trees are affiliated to different environmental conditions. And we get a community of the recruits of the new trees, drier and drier affiliated over time. So these are 2 points of showing some resilience of the Amazon system. And I just wanted to also show some hope on how we are using this information to then create change in society. So with a group of very nice Brazilian scientists, but also economists and communicators, we last year got together to use our science. Basically, the challenge was to use our science to create something that can be useful for policymaking, for conservation. And we were given this challenge by the Serra Pilheira Institute. And what we came up with was this portal that in the arc of deforestation, which is now being rebranded as the arc of restoration, we identify which areas were priority for conservation, for restoration, sorry. And also we use the data from species affiliations to environmental conditions, also data of species trends over time using that large inventory network. And we indicated which species should be planted in each place. So I'm talking here about more than 3,000 species, and we have for each site which species should be planted based on their distribution, their tolerance to drought, their tolerance to drought in the future, which is all work that we created from these inventory sites and looking at the forest over time. So we have done this for the Amazon, and now we are expanding this work to other sites in the neotropics. So expanding this understanding of biogeography informing resilience to climate change with the work from synthesis. So this is an even bigger network that spans across the neotropics with different networks of people that have been working together now to understand how the distribution of species, but also the number of trees in each site, which has also given understanding of how adapted the trees are to different climates, and allow us to give this understanding of how the link between the species, the different species, the diversity of species and climate. So this is ongoing work of this project that has been done really as a big collaboration. And I want to emphasize here the importance of collaborating with those people that collect the data and bringing them to the discussions and the scientific discussion as well. So the second part and there are three parts, just remember, but the second part is some work on understanding tree mortality. So this is a very important process, as you have seen, by looking at any changes in tree mortality and change, how much the forest can capture in terms of biomass. And we have seen these increases in tree mortality in different parts of the world. So we have seen them mainly in the Northern Hemisphere with interaction between drought and insect infestation, but we also have seen scattered places where mortality has risen across the world. But we don't have a clear sense of the baseline mortality. We don't know what is the starting point. And also we don't have a clear picture of these trends across the world. Also, we have a very bad mechanistic understanding of mortality. So this is an exercise trying to model mortality rates for the Amazon. And the top graphs here are the data. So these are gridded data from those inventory plots again. But this is above ground biomass losses. So this is mortality in biomass terms, and this is mortality in tree by tree terms. And these are the models trying to simulate turnover rates, trying to simulate mortality. And you can see that they don't do very well, right? There's no clear pattern in any of these models that would allow us to say that the models are predicting mortality. And this is because mortality is a kind of complex process, and it can happen in different ways. One example here is the tree can die standing, for instance, and this one that die standing from, it could be from drought, it could be from a pathogen, it could be from lightning. We just have normally no idea. Or another tree that died here, broken, and this tree could have died because of wind, because of a combination of liana load and wind, or could have died from other factors and then have been taken down by wind. So we don't have a clue really of how these processes are spread globally. We have some understanding for the Amazon. So for the Amazon, we've done this work a few years ago where using these inventory plots, we found out that, well, in the Western Amazon, which is it's a more dynamic system, mainly because you tend to have more disturbance events that tend to create those patterns of a more dynamic system, so higher mortality rates here. You tend to have more trees dying standing, so from other reasons, not disturbance, in the northern parts of the Amazon. And then in the south of the Amazon, you have high mortality rates, which also is in line with the work that I show about how things are changing. And here we think that drought has been playing a role in creating these very high mortality rates. But it would be very nice to have this for other forests. It would be very nice to have this understanding of mortality globally. And a few years ago, in a project that was led by Tom Pugh, a few colleagues and I, we put together what is this kind of global understanding of forest dynamics, and that allow us to now generate this map that can see some trends in higher and low areas of higher and lower mortality rates. We are also working to understand the drivers behind this mortality rate. So this is another effort that we are working on now, starting from first principles that higher productivity should lead to higher mortality, and we're testing that. That was something that was what we knew from theory. This preliminary results show that apparently it's not so simple. We don't find a relationship between biomass productivity and biomass mortality rates, not even when we divide the forest into different types of forests. Here is whether forests are mature or not mature, and across different regions. So we are exploring other factors such as climate, disturbance rates, but this is ongoing work. A question that we had was also, what will make the sink stop in different places? And because we know now the mortality rate, we know the biomass, we know the net biomass change in each of these sites, from this compilation of plots, we can calculate how much mortality needs to increase to reverse the sink. So it happened similar to what happened in 2015 El Nino for the Amazon. What would be the mortality increment that would be needed for that? So when we did that, this is the map of the distribution of this delta mortality, so the change in mortality rate, and this is how it's distributed over space. You can see that a few forests are already a source. But when we did that, we find that 20% in increasing mortality, so this is this line here, 20%, will reverse the sink in 1/5 of the current sink. So the sink would stop in 1/5 of what is currently seen in the sink. So this is not a very positive message, but also what we find is that mortality would need to double to stop the sink in 23% of our sampling. So this is the 100% line here. So from that on, mortality will need to double. And 33% of what is sink now will require doubling mortality rates for it to stop. So there is some sign of some forests being somehow in a position of resilience, of being able to adjust to allow for a little bit of increasing mortality before the sink is reversed. And this work, it's the work of a big group of people. These are some of the people. This is a meeting we had last year where we brought everyone together to try to create guidelines for what will be an ideal global a way of working with forest dynamics in a global scale. Because the important here is that we value the people that collect the data, the experts from different regions, and we don't do the work just from the global north, getting all the data together. Also, it's important that this data collection is continuous, so we as a community should figure out ways to raise funds for the continuity of this work, and also to foster the new generations that are coming. I want to highlight here that in this meeting, we couldn't bring the collaborators from the African countries because of visa restrictions. And this is another challenge when we are doing global work, is that we need to make sure that we create strategies to include everyone. And often that's not so easy, and we are learning with the process, but it's another challenge that needs to be considered. So now I'm going to move to the final part of the talk, which is the work with large trees. And this is a video, let's see. Yes, so this is a video. You can see the sign here because this is the tallest tree in the tropics, the largest flowering plant in Borneo. And these big trees, you can see how disproportionately big this one is from the ones around it. These big trees, the biggest 1% of the trees are responsible for 50% of all the biomass stock in a forest and 50% of all the carbon cycling in the forest. They are super important. But I mentioned 1% of the trees, right? The 1% biggest trees, meaning they are extremely rare in the landscape, which means they are extremely hard to study too. And these fascinating organisms, although they are so important, we know nothing, and we know very little about their mortality as well, because mortality is itself a hard thing to study. So a few years ago, my colleague Evan Gora and we got together to try to understand what would be the drivers of mortality for these large trees, and how these different potential drivers of mortality will change with size. So the first thing, this was just a literature review. So looking at the literature, we created these graphs that highlight some hypotheses from the literature. Firstly, we don't see much effect of biotic drivers creating mortality for large trees. It's that they are out of the competition. They are already so huge that they are the winners of the forest. They don't tend to suffer much from herbivores, and then there's no much reporting of trees dying from pathogens. That doesn't mean that there is no mortality caused by these drivers in tropical forests for large trees. That just means that we know nothing about it. But the expectation is, because they're so huge, they will be much harder to be killed by a pathogen, much harder to be killed by a herbivore. The opposite happens for abiotic drivers. So these are the drivers that are changing with climate change. So water stress, wind, lightning. These trees, as you've seen in the video, they are exposed in the above the canopy. And they are much more exposed to water stress, to wind, to lightning, and much more likely to then die from these causes. However, we don't know much about their mortality because we just don't study them enough. And they are probably very resilient as well. So because they have been surviving in these environmental conditions for a long time. So the question is how resilient they are. How are they doing? How are these trees doing? One thing that we've been working on was looking at how tree size structure changes in a forest. So here, if you have this is work I did together with Becky Bambury and also many other colleagues. But if you look at the size distribution of trees, so this is the diameter, their size, and their number. So this is the kind of what we observe from a size distribution once you log both axes. There are different ways that this can change in response to environmental change. So first, with more CO2 in the atmosphere, so more resources, the big trees, the ones that are the winners in the forest, they might do better. So we have more resources, the best competitors will just do better, and then you have more of these big trees. Second, what can happen is that the ones that are more limited by competition, they have limited amount of carbon with a little increase in the amount of carbon, little increase in resource that will make a big difference for them, and then they would be taking advantage. So the understory trees would do better. It could be that benefits are shared, and then both groups are doing well, and then the size class distribution just moves up. So you have more carbon packed in a forest over time. And it could also be that the large trees that are more exposed would lose out, because basically with greater aridity, more storms, these big trees will start dying, and then you see the size class distribution shifting its slope. So when we got the data from those inventory sites together, what we found over the last 30 years is that overall mean tree size across the Amazon is increasing. So not only you have more carbon in the system, each individual tree is getting bigger. So this is one thing that we've seen. The other thing is that the scaling parameter, which describes this curve, is shifting with there's the shape to favor more big trees. So you tend to have the carbon is more concentrated on big trees. When you look at how mean tree size is changing for the different size groups, we find that if you look at the forest in relative terms, the big trees, they're the ones which are increasing the most, the large trees. And you also see an increase in the very small ones. So that those trees that tend to be out competing because of light, they are also increasing in size. But the big trees are the true winners here. And this is surprising given that we expect them to be doing worse because they are more exposed to climate change. So overall, these large trees are gaining, but the winners are not taking all the small trees are also benefiting. This is somehow seen as a sign of resilience of these big trees because many studies have shown that they would be expected to die out, but actually we're not seeing that in this data yet. It could be twofold. We might not be seeing this because big trees are actually resilient, but we don't really have a good sample of mortality for these big trees in the inventory plots. So this is the size. So this is the error bars around the mortality rates for large trees. So the 1% largest, and this is the number. Sorry, the trees above 50 centimeters, and this is the number of trees above 50 centimeters that you have in a 1 hectare plot. You can see massive error bars. These are the plots that we normally use. If you expand the plots to 50 hectare plots, which is the biggest plots that we have in the tropics, famous one is Bajo Colorado Island in Panama, we still have massive error bars here. And note that this is in a log scale, the mortality rate. So we cannot tell anything really about their mortality rates. This is if we expand even further to 1,500 hectares of forest, then you start having much smaller errors around mortality rate. So then we could potentially estimate mortality rates for giant trees. We're getting in like hundreds or thousands of events of death per year with this size of plot, but it would be almost impossible to monitor such a large area in the tropics. So that's why a few colleagues and I a few years ago got together to, we designed this project to design basically a method to monitor. It's the Gigante project in which we want to quantify and upscale the causes and drivers of death for the giant trees. And the way to do that is basically using drone technology. So this is one of our field assistants, Adriane, in that region in the south of the Amazon. And what they're doing here is flying this drone, which has a vertical takeoff and landing and has an RGB camera that can take photos like this one that I just showed to you and identify the gaps. And we are getting photos up to 4 centimeter resolution across these sites. And we are flying this drone every month in our sites. And also, very importantly, we're getting to the sites, to the trees, the dead trees, very quickly. So within 1 to 7 weeks of the damage event or the disturbance happened, we go to the sites and we quantify turnover, and also we identify mechanisms. And this is something very different from what traditionally has been done, even for smaller trees, because by getting very quickly to the mortality event, we can really tell apart what's lightning, what is wind, and what's potentially drought or biotic events. We are repeating this across 5 sites in the tropics. So the sites I already told you about, this is Fazenda Veracruz in the south of the Amazon, the Duque Reserve in Central Amazon, Bajo Colorado Island, the Jar Reserve in Cameroon, and Danung Valley in Malaysia. And we are now moving from looking only at mortality to expand this work to also look at biodiversity. So with collaboration with Etienne Lalibert from Montreal, we are now being able to segment the crowns using AI. And the next step is then flying a smaller drone very close to the crowns, and also being able to differentiate what was one species from the other using AI again, and then in collaboration with a group of botanists and taxonomists, identifying those species, which would allow us to have a forest dynamic inventory plot of 1,500 hectares. That would change completely the way that we do ecology, and we change. It could potentially change the way that we do tropical ecology and expand our lens of seeing the world into larger scales. It's scales that I believe really matter for ecosystem processes. So This creates new opportunities to study ecology of tropical forests. If you are interested or know someone who is interested in working on these questions, I'm advertising a PhD project looking at the ecology and evolution of giant tropical trees. That would be part of the Gigante work. But this was my final story, which I think has some of resilience with the large trees increasing in size. Some of the stories of diagnosing change as well. And this idea of looking at my work and looking at what we do from this perspective of both acknowledging the crisis, but also creating ways to look at the system and their resilience is something I learned from collaborating with artists. This was the work, this is with our Spiral of Gratitude that was inspired by the work from Joanna Macy, but I learned about it from a group of artists called The Walking Forest in a project that we had funded by the Treescapes. And really what we did towards the end of the project is that we package our final report in a way that shows the way, the awe that we see for nature, how we acknowledge the crisis, and then how we create fresh perspectives and move forward and create change. And this is us working in the project, but here is bringing all the policymakers plus scientists plus artists together to try to use the science and to create new ways of managing UK forests in particular. And I would like to acknowledge that and also really encourage you guys to work with artists if you're not doing that yet, because it can really change the way that we see our own science. And something that brings me a lot of awe and joy, and something that really makes this work happen, is all the people that work with me. And I'm really grateful. This work here I'm the presenter, but it's the work of hundreds of people and many early career researchers that I've been very privileged to work with. And with that, I just want to thank you and look forward to questions.
Taking questions from.
Yeah.
So we'll take questions from the room and online. Online, I'll read them out. So if you just type them in, then I'll read them out. But start. Anyone got any questions?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm very interested about the research of nature plants as large tree gains, no matter the number, also the size. Yeah, and I'm curious about how to divide the this is small tree. You mean that from 0 to 200, you identify them as small tree.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the result is that the small tree has the number of small trees is actually declining. Yeah, if you like you identify the small tree from 0 to 100, then maybe you would get a different result. So I'm curious about.
Yeah, I think. What's your name? Sorry. Qianyu is asking here about the size cutoff for what we see changes in tree size. So basically, if we were to look at the trees from 0 to 100, maybe we would see a different change than what we really see in the paper. And that's a really good point. We don't really understand what's happening in smaller size classes because there's not enough data. The inventory sites, they tend not to monitor the very small size classes. So this is some other work I didn't present, but we are also in the UK where we have those data, we are finding a decline in recruitment rates, and that started a lot of work on what would be causing changes in recruitment rates. But yeah, my answer for the tropics is that we don't know the trajectory of those small trees for the tropics, basically.
Okay.
Question but I'm going to ask a quick kind of follow-up. But earlier on, you showed us strong evidence that southern Amazon, the trees are, so the carbon stock is now effectively a source. And then in your nature plants study, the most recent one, the largest size class, the arrows seem to be all going up, and that's 50% of biomass. So where's the mortality to drive the downwards trend in the southern Amazon coming from?
Yeah, so I haven't broke down. So first of all, the striking thing to me about that nature plant study is that we find the trend happening everywhere, and I never seen such a strong trend for this data before. Then the mortality rates that we show in the other work that we are working on now is the stem-based mortality, so that's not biomass change. So that could be potentially, if you bring these two things together, meaning that the smaller trees are the ones which are dying more in southern Amazon, but I haven't broken them into size classes yet. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. There's a question from Anna Wood. She says, "Hi, great talk. I was wondering, do your drones use multispectral or LiDAR?"
No, so we don't use multispectral LiDAR. We just use RGB, but we do fly. We have the flights very overlapped, so we can get some structure for motion in understanding of the forest, but also the changes in structure as well as the change in color.
Is it for the Amazon is a carbon sink in the past and not at equilibrium?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There are two main hypotheses for that. Two main things that could be happening to the forest that could lead to that. One is maybe these forests are recovering from past disturbance, so they are in recovery trajectory and therefore not in equilibrium. Or there is some change in the environment that will maybe allow them to grow more than die, basically, right? And then the main driver for that would be the additional CO2 in the atmosphere. If we look at other trends through time that would be linked to recruitment rate, recovery rates, for instance, we would see a change in composition towards more heavy wooded trees. And actually, we are seeing somehow the opposite, so more lighted wooden trees. So that would be on the kind of direction of CO2 changing this forest rather than a change from disturbance rates.
You had a question?
Yeah, in your study on giant trees, you show that you interpreted that the fact that trees are being even larger could be a sign of resilience. But could it be also like a bad sign that like regeneration is crashing all over the tropics? Because like the higher strata is becoming like higher and bigger and maybe denser, like the underlying tree strata could be like just not growing as fast as before, just not as resilient as we would like to.
Your name, sorry?
Anne.
Anne is asking here about whether the interpretation, so the interpretation from the increase in tree size was interpretation in terms of like these forests are more resilient, but it could also mean the other way around. It could mean that there is no recruitment and then these forests are actually maybe doing worse than they were before. I think that might be the case as well, but also like the large trees, they are increasing. So you have a canopy that is staying there longer potentially because the size is increasing and you have more trees getting into the canopy layer. So I think the two things could be happening at the same time. But one thing is that we would expect those trees to be going, and they are standing there still. What's happening with recruitment, I think it's harder to interpret because we would need to really get recruitment at the time scale that links to the changes. We would need the smaller trees. But I agree that it could be seen both ways as well.
Yeah, well, my worry would be that it would be the sign of like approaching the kind of tipping point where like the dynamic of forest is reaching like a kind of like high forest and then innovation at some crash. But I don't know if there are like any sign of that kind of dynamics.
Yeah, so Anna is worried about the sign of tipping point if those trees become, if you don't have any recruitment, those trees would then potentially the system would then collapse if those trees are gone. Yeah, I think it's a good point. But yeah, I think it's a good point. The thing is we don't really know what's happening with those smaller trees. And it could be that they are worse off, but we don't know. Yeah.
I did want to. I wanted to ask about the huge plot network. How many of those plots might have suffered fire? contemporary fire?
Yeah.
Or is that something that's missing from your amount of carbon that's being emitted on average?
Yeah, so these plots are, the ones used for this analysis are only the kind of the more, let's say, mature forest, non-disturbed or unknown disturbed. So we don't know if there has any, we don't have any sign of disturbance over time. Yeah, so there are also other plots we fire in the database, but those are not the ones that we are using. And if we look at places where there has been more fire and there is a work from Luciana Gatti looking at changes in carbon dynamics from using other methods, not inventory plots. And you are seeing that many parts of the Amazon are actually kind of becoming a carbon source. But this is due to fire, deforestation.
Is there any last questions? In which case, before we thank you again, I just wanted to say our next talk will be on the 4th of December. It's by Yun Ma from Fudan University. He'll be talking about the patterns and ecological consequences and restoration responses for forest fragmentation. With that, Adriane, once again, thank you so much for a fascinating